Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can listen you, Professor.
Was he asking about my slides, my presentation?
That we can, after the formal introduction, everything, you can share the screen, because during that, once you share that, your pic video will be very small one. So while we are introducing you, you should be in the large screen.
Very good.
Sir, participants are joining. We will start in a minute, sir.
Is it their practice to post questions in the chat while I'm speaking? Is that encouraged?
We'll have a Q&A session later, sir. Normally that will not take the Q&A session while you're speaking. Once you complete the session, then we'll have a Q&A session.
I see. Although
And
I wouldn't mind if they post, but we take the questions. We answer the questions in the forum, but I don't mind if they post questions while I speak.
Okay.
Just to give us an idea how they're thinking.
Yes, connectivity will be there.
Yes.
And Professor Ram will be taking care of all the questions, and he will be listing on priority of first in first. Normally we'll have around 20 to 35 questions on average, what we have seen that.
I see. So I was told I was to speak for 45 to 60 minutes. Is that still correct?
Yes, Professor. Yes, Professor.
Which means that, okay, I'm orienting myself to the time. I should be ending around, yeah, on or before 9:30 my time. Okay.
Sir, people are joining. Shall we start formally, sir? Let me introduce.
Take 2 minutes more. Let them, I think already 60, 70 people crossed, isn't it?
Yes, sir. There are 35. Others are joining in YouTube also.
Yes, Professor Ram, I think we should start now. 5 minutes already over.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, for your information, we record this session for our future academic purposes. We need your permission.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. We are happy to welcome you all for the 8th program of Firebird International Webinar Series. And today, it's a great pleasure. We have Professor Benito L. Tijanque. He's from Philippines. He teaches organization research philosophy, management, leadership, also business ethics. So he is well versed and he is known authority in critical realism in organization studies. We happened to meet him in a conference like this. Shown our interest to host Professor's lecture in Firebird webinar series. We also agreed happily. Thank you so much, sir, for your acceptance. So I will give this brief introduction after the presidential address of our director, sir, Dr. P. Srinivasa Rao. So now I welcome Dr. P. Srinivasa Rao to offer his presidential address.
Good evening, Professor, and good evening all the professors across the country and across other countries, research scholars, students, my dear faculty members, and other industry partners and members. A very warm welcome to all of you for the webinar, today's webinar, the critical realism in organization studies. Professor Benito carries a lot of credentials and his studies on ethics and corporate governance and corporate realism and the international relationship. All this makes a lot of sense to the community to learn. And we're very happy to invite him into today's webinar, international webinar series. And Dr. Ram Kumar will go in detail the profile of Dr. Benito. And before that, I would like to introduce Firebird as a business school with different kinds of vision and mission. And we are a business school which is industry linked business school. And this is an SR work of Siva Texan Limited and Bannari Amman Group. We are an industrial house of 2,500 crores turnover group. We have various verticals. And the founder of the business school, Dr. S.K. Sundararaman, has really identified the gap between the academia and industry. And he feels that business school should have a highly industry-oriented practices. And towards that academic and industry excellence, we keep on practicing various concepts. So one of the concepts we practice at Firebird is a 30-70 model. We call it as action learning program, where our students are exposed to the industry on every day while having their academic inputs in the half day. Second half day, they go to industry and they work as interns for the whole 2 years program of business management. And also we give a lot of importance to individual development, what we call in the name of personality enhancement program. Under this program, students are etiquettes, body language, grooming, his social quotient, emotional quotient, and his public speaking. And the overall as a human, we consider him to be the first priority rather than having a professionalism. Professionalism, of course, we train them, but human development we consider. And today's topic, when we see that the realism is concerned, so we have a different facets when we call different classical theories are there, neoclassical theories are there, when other military anarchy concepts also there in the realism. But when we focus on the realism factor into an organization, and we believe that today in the globalization, the common goals are being set to be achieved rather than power or scientific evolvement or maybe business domains. Today, we do dictate every organization that we should follow the UN objectives for the overall balance of economy, overall balance of human development. And this topic is very vital for all the scholars. And we work under the All India Council of Technical Education, which is an apex body apart from UGC in the country, which is focusing more on the stakeholders of the education, industry, business community for an equal development. The realism of the state is a balance, a state of balance for the everybody. It is not the technology dominance, it is not the economic dominance, It is not the military dominance, rather it is a balance of power, education. And almost all under the new education policy, our government has really given more impact on the equal development of the society and the wisdom to learn. And today's topic is really a wonderful topic, that how an organization should collaborate and bring a cohesive culture and make a world as a peaceful center. And we are in India, we are known for one statement we call that Sarvo Sukhino Bhava. That means every life in this earth should be, equally has a right to live and prosper. And under your theories of today's realism, I think all the research scholars and all the faculty members will be really enlightened, and a warm welcome to the webinar. And further to this, Dr. Ram, you are here to go in details the professor's profile.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your nice welcome address as well as presidential address. Yeah, it's time to introduce our professor, our guest of today. Dr. Benito L. Teehankee is the Jose E. Cuisia Professor of Business Ethics at the Management and Organization Department of the Roman V. del Rosaria College of Business. It's located in De La Salle University, Philippines. He is the head of the Business and Human Development Network under the Center for Business Research and Development of the university. He is currently serving in various institutions and universities. He is actually a past and founding president and current board of member of the Philippine Academy of Management. He is a past and founding president of Philippine E-Learning Society, past president of the Philippine Society for IT Educators. He is a past president of the Pambansong Samahan Psikologiang Filipino, Philippine National Association for Psikologiang Filipino. He is a current member of the Ethics Committee of the Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Association of the Philippines. He is a past vice chair of the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee of the Management Association of Philippines and current trustee of the Shareholders Association of the Philippines. He was a member of the United Nations Global Compact Academic Institutions Working Group, which developed the practical guide to the United Nations Global Compact for Higher Education Institutions. So we are very proud to have Professor Benito Teehankee here to address on critical realism in organization studies. And we welcome you, sir. And also I am happy to welcome all the participants from varied discipline, domain, as well as different geographical. I welcome everyone. I request Professor Benito Teehankee to take over the session. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, Ramkumar.
Good evening.
Good evening, Professor. Good evening to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here in this Firebird activity to share some ideas on this philosophy of science of critical realism as applied to organization studies. May I confirm if my screen is visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Wonderful. Because every time I use technology, I'm always praying that it actually works. So I'm glad that it works this time. So my topic is critical realism in organization studies. And since I only have maybe 45 minutes or so, and this might be a new topic for many of us, so I will look forward to many of your questions. And as a matter of fact, if questions occur to you, you may already post them in the chat. We will tackle those questions later, but as the questions occur to you, feel free to put them in the chat already. It also gives me an idea how the thoughts are working through your mind so that later on we can be more engaged. So what I wanted to do was to share with you the following things. I wanted to describe a little bit how I arrived at critical realism. It's sort of a personal journey, but I thought it would help you appreciate where I'm coming from. And then we will discuss the approach that we're all familiar with, which we call the mainstream positivist approach. However, I will especially highlight some of the limitations of this approach, which is why critical realism can make a contribution to address some of the limitations of the positivist approach. And then I will cite some personal experiences of doing critical realist research, in particular, a paper I presented in the Academy of Management on social academic entrepreneurship. This is an area I'm very much interested in, how academics can innovate or create patents and be able to commercialize these into successful commercial products, which is called academic entrepreneurship. And then let me share with you a new article on critical realist interviewing, because this just came out in 2022. And I thought this would be an exciting item to share with you because it's very new. And I'm also glad that it came out this year because a lot of questions have come out on how specifically to use critical realism in doing interviews. So this is what I'd like to share with you within the next 45 minutes. So a little bit about my journey. My background really is in the behavioral sciences and management for my undergraduate. I've always been interested in why people do the things they do. So my studies in behavioral sciences focus on psychology, sociology, and anthropology. But also I took a degree in business management. So it's a double degree. I have an undergraduate business degree and a degree in behavioral sciences. And this heavily influenced my approach to research. Every time I look at organizations, I always look at them both from the behavioral science perspective and the business perspective. I did my master's in statistics because I became very interested in quantitative analysis during my undergraduate years. So I pursued, to the great surprise of many of my friends, I pursued a master's in statistics, even though I did not have a mathematics degree or an engineering degree, which was typical for those who pursue graduate training in statistics. I just got so interested in it. Of course, it took me a long time to finish my master's in statistics. It took me 2 years longer than my classmates, but I completed it. And then I went on to do my doctorate in business. And so I started my teaching career teaching statistics and research methods since the 80s. This is because I've always been interested in research and I always like the rigor, the analysis, the reasoning that undergoes research. And I must confess that my orientation has always been positivist. In fact, one of my first publications in 1994 was recent advances in causal modeling. During that time, structural equation modeling and latent variable path analysis was just coming to the fore. Not many research was being done in the Philippines using structural equation modeling, but I was fascinated by it and I felt this was really a very promising analytic tool. Nowadays, even undergraduate students use this because you have software tools that can allow you to do this very easily. But during that time, it was very difficult to find actual users of this. And around that time, I also already started pointing out some of the issues in statistical analysis that I was noticing because there was a tendency to use statistical analysis in a very mechanical way, often without thought, sort of like a cookbook approach. In 1999, I went more into the qualitative area. I started teaching business ethics. I became very concerned about what was happening in our country, especially the growing inequality, the corruption, the growing environmental degradation, and what I felt was the important role of business in addressing these issues. But I also started experiencing dissatisfaction with management research as it was being practiced. Why, you might ask? Well, I felt that a lot of the management research was very preoccupied with producing knowledge that was uncontextualized, meaning to say it was more like recipe knowledge that did not consider local values, for example, indigenous beliefs, cultural context, all of which I consider very important because in the Philippines, we were occupied by the Americans for about 50 years. And if you walk into a typical Philippine management class, about 99% of the frameworks being taught were American. So many of our graduates in business will mainly know American frameworks. They had no sense of what indigenous Filipino management would look like, even though as Filipinos, of course, they understand that our values are very different from the Americans. And yet, what we teach them are essentially American management models. And also management research emphasized being detached, meaning not involved. It's a very clinical approach. You send surveys to organizations, you wait for them to respond, then you collect the surveys, then you tabulate, you do the statistical analysis. It's very rare that the researchers were really immersed in the field. They were not really doing work with the organizations themselves. So this for me was not very interesting as an approach to research, because you have to remember my background is social anthropology. So I approach management research more from an engaged point of view, because anthropology, of course, believes in ethnography, observational studies, even participant observation. The key is to really understand the phenomenon you're studying by being immersed in it. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there was a very strong emphasis on quantified research alone. Well, as I mentioned, I have a degree in statistics, so I'm not averse to quantification. However, I'm a strong believer that quantification by itself often hides more than it shows. In fact, when I teach statistics to my students, I kind of dramatize this point by telling them and making them repeat that the mean, meaning the arithmetic mean, the mean doesn't mean anything. Because I tell them that the mean is a central tendency measure. And therefore, when you reduce a data set to just one number, it tends to hide a lot of very important information. And of course, there is always the claim in management research that it is value-free, that it is mainly focused on efficiency, and so on. Okay, so, all right. So to address some of these difficulties, I began, can you hear me okay? Okay, I began to move to action research in the 2000s. As some of you may know, because you're also practicing action learning, action research is really doing research by being involved in practice. And more importantly, by doing the research involved in practice, you extract knowledge or theory from the practice itself. So what you develop are practical theories because they are derived from actual, shall we say, social experimentation in the organization. Unlike a lot of the theories that are developed in management research, which are often developed by faculty members who are never really directly engaged in the work. So this tends to be quite abstract theories as against applied theories. And then when I took my sabbatical in 2014, I found philosophical support in critical realism as a philosophy of science in 2014. So you can see from my journey that I have training in the social sciences, in management and statistics, but I was slowly being disenchanted by the dominant positivist approach and slowly moving into more practice types of research. And then I found critical realism because it was a scientific philosophy that supported my own inclination to be more applied, more contextual, less mechanical in research, not over privileging quantification over narratives or immersion in actual practice. And I presented my first critical realist paper in the Academy of Management in 2018. Now, when we teach research, we normally tell our students, well, these are the goals of science, to describe phenomena, to explain, to predict, and ultimately to control. We kind of drill this into their heads. And for us, this has become also quite mechanical. But actually, given the situation of the world where so much knowledge has been generated, but human suffering continues, we have to ask ourselves, what is really the calling to improve the science of management so that we can make the world a better place? So this is how I approach management research. We look at local, national, and regional challenges in our context, in our country, particularly poverty and human indignity, environmental degradation, and climate change. And then we ask ourselves, what is the role of responsible management to address these? And how can sustainable business practices be used so that these challenges can be reversed? And therefore, to achieve this, knowledge has to be relevant and rigorous so that these challenges can be addressed effectively. Therefore, it's not enough to produce knowledge. It's not enough to have citations or publications or even books. What's important is that the knowledge that is being produced is actionable, and actionable knowledge comes from practice. It is both relevant and rigorous. And this is where, again, critical realism comes in as a helpful philosophy of science. So when we say relevant research, it must be research that addresses real human concerns. And when we speak of rigor, we speak of research that applies sound and ethical conceptualizations and methodologies. There are, of course, different paradigms. One article I read documented about 15 research paradigms, but the most popular are positivism, postmodernism, or sometimes referred to as hermeneutics, and critical realism. So these are not in any order of importance, but I just show this table because it just shows some contrasts between positivism and critical realism. So ontology, which is our study of what reality is, as far as positivism is concerned, the ontology of positivism is objectivist. positivism claims that there is a reality outside of the researcher. So for example, if I'm studying a marketing strategy as a researcher, I have to assume that there is such a thing as a strategy, there is such a thing as marketing that exists outside of me. So even if I don't study marketing strategy, I assume that there could be such a thing. Of course, hermeneutics says that reality is subjective, meaning marketing strategy exists only because I believe it exists, or only because I look at it and I study it. And here, critical realism is very much similar to the ontology of positivism. Critical realism also believes that there are realities outside of the researcher. So that is where it is a little bit different from hermeneutics. Now, let's look at epistemology. This is where critical realism has a slight difference from positivism, because positivism claims that it's epistemology, and epistemology is the philosophy of how we come to know about things. It's a study of how we know things. And this is the basis of methodology. Positivism believes that method can be objective, meaning you can really study reality in a way that is completely free from any bias of the researcher. Here, critical realism differs, because critical realism believes that human subjectivity is unavoidable. However, we try to know the reality as much as possible, and we try to counterbalance our biases, but it will always be there because we are human beings. So here you can see that positivism and critical realism tend to be different in epistemology, but similar in ontology. I looked at the Academy of Management journals recently in 2021, and I looked at the most cited in the journal, and practically most of them are quantitative positivist studies. Multi-level modeling, factor analysis, secondary data, regression, multi-level path analysis, and of course, secondary data regression analysis. In fact, only one in 5 used inductive process analysis and qualitative analysis. So which means that even in the leading management journals, this may not be the same in India, but at least in the US as a reference point, quantitative method is still dominant. And this is easy to understand because many of the thought leaders of the 20th century and earlier in the 18th century really emphasize on positivism. For example, David Hume emphasized that causation is constant conjunction of events, meaning if events happen at the same time, this is what he means by causation. So for example, if we use advertising and then there is an increase in sales, and then we try it again, we do advertising, there's an increase in sales. If these events happen at the same together frequently enough, we say advertising is causing the increase in sales, right? Later on, the Carl Hempel developed what he called the deductive demological method of scientific study. This became the foundation for the hypothesis testing method. Yeah. And Karl Popper, of course, famously emphasized that scientific theories must be falsifiable. That means you have to be able to test them. That's why this supported the null hypothesis testing approach, because every time we set up a hypothesis, we ask ourselves, so if our hypothesis is true, what kind of quantitative data can we use? And then what is the opposite of that? We can frame that as the null hypothesis, and let's see if we have evidence against the opposite of our research hypothesis. And that method was developed by Neyman and Pearson, which became the famous statistical hypothesis testing using critical values. This is the method that we are all familiar with now. But we can see the intellectual, shall we say, genesis of this. Now, I don't mention here Ronald Fisher, although he is considered one of the originators of statistical inference, because Fisher himself did not really use critical values per se. It was Neyman and Pearson who formalized that method. But to be fair, Fisher should always be included in any discussion of statistical method because he developed most of the tests that we are familiar with. Ronald Fisher, of course, invented the ANOVA F test, thus F for Fisher, and he also invented the chi-square test, which we are all familiar with. So let's start with a basic example. This is how positivism works. When we ask ourselves, when we put water in a pot and boil it, what happens when water is heated? And then we ask ourselves, what if we plot temperature and then the amount of steam that is coming out? So we look at the temperature below the pot, and then we look at the amount of steam coming out, and then we put them in a scatter plot like so. And in fact, we often frame it this way: temperature leads to conversion to steam. So this we call the dependent variable, and this we call the independent variable. This is typical in positivist research, right? Depending on the author, sometimes this is called the predictor variable. Sometimes it's also called the explanatory variable. The dependent variable is sometimes also called the criterion variable. So therefore, given that reasoning that we saw, the standard positivist explanation, which was developed by Hempel, if you remember, the deductive nomological model, also called the DN model, usually proceeds this way. And most of our researchers follow this. There's a literature review, and then we look at the literature, the theory, past research, and then we make predictions. We call these predictions hypotheses. So based on the theory, based on past research, we say that if we, for example, we say that if we use social media to target young consumers, then our product will have high recognition among young consumers, because young consumers tend to occupy social media, right? And that might be the basis of our deduction. So this is called a deduction. A deduction is from general to specific. So we have a general theory, which is informed by literature, and then from that, we derive a specific hypothesis. And then we ask ourselves, what data can we use so that we can test this hypothesis? So we collect this data following, the rules for sampling, etc. And then we analyze. We look for patterns. We look for patterns in our data, and then we compare the patterns with our hypothesis, which we predicted here, and then conclude if the hypotheses are supported or not. And then we discuss. We elaborate how theory explains the empirical data, and this discussion is called the covering law model of explanation. So the covering law model of explanation really is a deductive type of approach. We start with literature, and then we hypothesize, and then we get data, and we see if our data confirms or supports our hypothesis. So this approach is drilled into every research student, more or less worldwide. Now, as an example, let me cite one of the most cited research in the Academic Management Journal. This is the study of Huslid on high-performance work practices. Of course, this is something we're all interested in. We want to find out, what is it that companies should do so that the workers will perform very well, right? So Huslid defined high-performance work practices as comprehensive employee recruitment and selection procedures, incentive compensation and performance management systems, extensive employee involvement and training, and this was published in his very well-known article in 1995. Mark Huslid is one of the most cited researchers in the academic management, but this article alone, the impact of human resource management practices on turnover, productivity, and corporate financial performance, published in 1995, has been cited more than 15,000 times. So it's certainly one of the most cited articles in the Academic Management Journal. Now, if we look at this article more closely, it said that it comprehensively evaluated the links between systems of high-performance work practices and firm performance. So if you remember our diagram earlier, so we're looking at high-performance work practices as our independent variable, and then we're looking at firm performance as our dependent variable here. So, and then they used a very high sample size, almost 1,000 firms, and then they used statistical analysis. But in addition to firm performance, they also looked at other dependent variables, particularly turnover, the rate at which employees would resign, and productivity. So this is quite an extensive study. It looked at how high-performance work practices affects financial performance, employee turnover, and productivity. So therefore, it's not a surprise that this is one of the most highly cited papers in the Academy of Management. This is a very interesting topic, I would agree. And partly what one of the findings here is that if you look at high performance workplace architecture, they saw indeed that the financial performance of the company, as the company built more high performance work system architecture, the market value per employee was recorded to be increasing in a very noticeable way. So this is what we would call a positive correlation. And researchers would attribute, would call this the impact of HR on shareholder value. And then they explained it this way: business strategic initiatives, design of human resource management systems, produce employee skills, employee motivation, design work structures, and this would influence productivity, creativity, discretionary effort, and then this would lead to improved performance, profits, and growth, and market value. This is what they call the Husted HR value model. The interesting thing, and we will find this out later, is although they have this model, they claim not to have really looked into this explanatory dynamics in their study. By the way, Mark Huslid, he did his dissertation on this topic, and then he published this very successful article. And Brian Becker is a very well-known authority in organizational studies, and he was a dissertation advisor. And from this collaboration, both of them successfully published very influential works: the HR scorecard, the workforce scorecard, and the differentiated workforce in 2009. So this is a typical process of how dissertation research becomes highly cited in publications, and then it yields a series of books that influences practice. This also happened with Michael Porter, of course. We will recall that when Porter did his dissertation in the late 70s on the 5 forces and competitive advantage, this also made his book on competitive advantage extremely popular later on. But the question is, even though there's a very high correlation, is there really an explanation for the link between high-performance workplaces? In fact, they themselves, by their admission, in their article, said that the work of Huslid and Becker suggests that a properly designed and deployed HR system is a significant economic asset. And this is what they say. This is their emphasis. It does not, however, provide direct evidence of how such a system creates value. They did not really look into this. Essentially, what this means is they looked at the correlation, but they did not really look at the how. This was not covered in their studies. And they say, to date, there is very little research that peels back the onion and describes the processes through which HRM systems influence the principal intermediate variables that ultimately affect firm performance. So what that means is that even though they presented this diagram here, they really did not collect any evidence on this. So this remains like a black box. Essentially, what they have is the correlation between this and this. So this is the X and this is the Y, which is typical in a lot of management research. Okay. So therefore, when we publish books, often what publishers do so that books will sell is they claim that the recommendations of the book are called best practices. Now, this is I could personally think that this is a very difficult to justify practice, because in the first place, who is to say what is best practice? Because human beings and cultural contexts vary across different locations, of course, and across different human conditions. So they themselves said, Becker et al., the co-author of Huslid, said, there is too much focus on best practice, and it is misguided and may even be counterproductive because it diverts managerial effort from the difficult and time-consuming job of developing an internally coherent and externally aligned HRM system. So notice that even though the study itself is positivist, and remember the goal of positivist research is to find a covering law, meaning a generalization that we can try to apply to as many contexts as possible. But they themselves said that if you try to generalize and claim that something is best practice, you could actually be quite misguided, because you always have to find a way to contextualize studies of management. Because after all, management research will always involve social context and human psychology. Now, one of the most glaring limitations of positivist management research is that it tends to focus only on empirically measurable data. So this focus on empiricism, especially once this is entered into the standard methods that we use, usually analysis of variance, regression, etc., it only speaks of averages, especially for large samples. As I mentioned earlier, I tend to always tell my students the mean doesn't mean anything. Even students, or if we have children and they have grades, let's say for six subjects that they're taking in school, and then we ask our kids, oh, how are you doing in school? And he says, I'm okay, my average is so and so. But the wise parent should also know the individual grades, because we know that averages tend to hide a lot of information. And here we can see, this is a typical regression line with this equation. Y is this constant plus this coefficient times x. What is right away noticeable is that the line actually does not cover most of the points. In fact, most of the points are not on the line. The line represents all the averages, meaning for this amount of income, this is the amount of happiness of people, right? But we can see that there are so many people who are not even in the line. In fact, for managers and organizations, I doubt if there are many managers who will admit that they are an average manager, or an organization that will admit, I am an average organization. I don't think business and management is about being average, right? Precisely, business and management is about being exceptional, exemplary, better than others. So why do we emphasize averages so much? This tends to be the practice, because precisely many of the statistical methods that are available use averages. Analysis of variance is, of course, a comparison of averages. Regression is, of course, looking at averages across different values. These are really averages. So if you look at this as probability distributions, they're really averages. Which is why when I read research, or I have a doctoral dissertation researchers present their regression coefficient, as a matter of practice, I always insist to see the scatter plot. Because when you see the scatter plot, you see the story underlying the average. So if we don't see these points and only see the equation, we think that all of reality is captured by the line, right? But right away, we can see that if we see the scatter plot, there is more than meets the eye. And this is where really things become really interesting, when we look at what is really happening contextually rather than just through averages. So with the popularity of positivism, but as we can see, it has some limitations. It's not perfect. Enters critical realism. Now, Roy Bhaskar is a Indian-British philosopher who wrote a seminal book in 1975 entitled A Realist Theory of Science, or we just call it RTS, and which he followed up with the possibility of naturalism in 1979. Now, for the most part, critical realism was not very popular. It only became a niche topic among some, but the goal of critical realism is deepening our explanations and understanding. It took a while for critical realism to enter the management field, but when it did, it started to grow. So in particular, I remember in 1989, the Academy of Management Review had a special issue just on methodology. It is a very important issue. I think all of us should read volume 14, number 4, because this is where, for example, Wake talked about theorizing as imagination. This is where case study research by Eisenhardt was discussed. So there were many, many important articles in this particular issue of the Academy of Management Review. But in that same journal article was this article by Harry Tsoukas. He has a blog. He's still very active now, which spoke of critical realism. And the title was The Validity of Ideographic Research Explanations. So ideographic are explanations that are qualitative explanations, sort of like stories or narratives. Because often when we speak of validity, we equate validity with statistical studies, quantitative studies, right? Where we use, factor analysis to validate, Cronbach alpha to test reliability, etc. But what about the validity of narrative explanations? What about that? And actually, my confession is I read this issue of Academy of Management review when I was a doctoral student, and I completed my doctorate in 1998. But I never noticed this article. It was there, but I never paid attention to it, which means that I was so intent on just looking at positivist studies that I completely ignored this. But later on, different years, more and more critical realist books started coming out on management. The most recent one was this by Edwards and others, studying organizations using critical realism. This one was earlier on. I believe this was 2003 and 2005, respectively. Realist Perspectives on Management and Organizations by Ackroyd and Fleetwood. And then Critical Realist Application in Organization and Management Studies by Fleetwood and Ackroyd, the same authors. So what is the shift? What is CR saying to organizational researchers? The shift is essentially along 4 points. Instead of just using method, we have to think of methodology. Method is really tools and procedures. For example, factor analysis, analysis of variance regression, surveys, interviews. These are methods. But methodology includes a philosophy of science, meaning it explains why we use certain methods. Because sometimes I ask my students, so why are you using structural equation modeling, or why are you using multiple regression? They're often at a loss what to explain. Because they say, well, it's a popular tool, or it's because I have the software for it. See, so this is what I mean by a cookbook approach to research that sometimes doesn't encourage a deeper consideration. So the issue here is, how do we deepen the rigor of our research by critiquing our assumptions? In other words, why do we assume that multiple regression applies in this kind of study? What is it about the phenomenon that convinces us of that? The second shift is from correlation to explanation. How do we deepen our explanation of what is really happening in management and organizations and businesses so that we can really understand? I remember when you teach children to turn on the light, they will turn on the switch on the wall and press it, and then they will see the light come on. So the important question is this, and you can try this with your children, preferably very young kids. Then you ask them, okay, every time I pop this, the light turns on, right? So what do you think is happening? So you can listen to their explanations. But I don't think they will simply say, well, because every time we turn this on, that turns on, therefore this causes that. They have to ask themselves, why is this happening? So this is really the poverty of the explanation of Hume. Mere conjunction does not really mean explanation. For example, if the kid hears a switch make a popping sound, she could speculate that the popping sound causes the light bulb to turn on. Because remember, they have no idea of electricity, or that there are wires behind the wall, right? Or how electrical energy is transmitted to the light bulb, and even less how the filament of the bulb works, etc. But I don't think we can certainly accept as an explanation simply that the light turns on because I popped the switch. The light turns on because I popped the switch. That is not an explanation. It is simply a correlation. In the same way, when we say, oh, if you have extensive HR practices, this will lead to positive firm performance. This begs the question, why does it work? What happens now in research is that when students report the results, often we are satisfied by them saying, well, because there was a statistically significant relationship between this variable and this, therefore we know that this is the explanation for this. So CR, critical realism says that the correlation is just the beginning of the story. We need to understand why. We need to try to dig deeper, or at least have a coherent explanation of what's going on. The third shift is from detachment to engagement. So I was very happy to hear from the professor doctor that you are into action learning, which means that when we are learning, we cannot simply be detached from what we're studying. Because our values come into play, and certainly in management, values come into play. human beings are not merely tools. Human beings are not merely vending machines. Sometimes I use the analogy of vending machines where we put in money, we push a button and something comes out, right? So sometimes management is taught as if managing is like a vending machine. You pay a person's salary, you give him an order, and you expect output to come out. And I'm sure you know this. What do you do when the vending machine does not produce the output? You check if there's a camera and then you hit the machine, right? Now, this is sometimes what happens with people. When they don't give us the output we want, we might use intimidation or we might use threats, etc. But is this really what our values dictate that we should do? So this is another shift of critical realism. And finally, from status quo to transformation. Are we satisfied with the way things are, or should we transform the way things are? For example, nowadays, because of the pandemic and a lot of the toxic pressures of broken supply chains, health concerns among people, death in the families of so many, mental health issues, should we be doing management as usual, or should we reinvent the practice of management? I think we should reinvent the practice of management. I think 90% of management, as we were teaching it before the pandemic, should be thrown out the window. We should already rethink how, in a pandemic, a vulnerable world where we have the fourth industrial revolution, where you have biotech, nanotech, and infotech all coming together, and robotics affecting everything with machine learning, we should already ask ourselves, what is the science of management going to do now? How do we need to transform? What do we need to do in the management field to transform this so that we can change the way work itself is done? So in a way, critical realism is a very radical approach to research because it does not accept the status quo. So let's look at our pot example again. Remember earlier we said the hotter the pot, the more steam, right? But as we said, this begs the question of why. What's the story? Now, the story, of course, we can get from most physics textbooks. And I got one such story. Why does water turn into steam when heated? Now, this is a story told by scientists, which dramatizes that science is never satisfied only with correlations. And this is the story from one article. Water is made of tiny molecules in a state of constant motion. Between these molecules are intermolecular forces, which at normal temperatures are sufficient to hold the molecules together. Okay, so it's like they have a natural attraction to each other, even though they're moving. But if the temperature is not so high, the movement is not so much that they are torn apart. They tend to be attracted to each other. Now, this is where the interesting thing happens. If the water is heated, however, the energy and consequently the motion of the molecules acquire enough energy to overcome the intermolecular forces. Therefore, the molecules fly apart and escape into the atmosphere. And therefore, water gives off steam. So here, you can see that the richness of the story, even though it's idiographic, it is scientific. Because some will say, oh, a story is not scientific, show me the numbers. Well, this doesn't have a number because it's a process, it's a narrative. It's qualitative, certainly, but it is real, it is confirmable. And there are theories that explain each part of the story. So you can see why critical realism is always interested in the why, the story underneath any quantitative result. This is from Friedman and Manikas. So this is how critical realism tends to view reality. Whereas positivism mainly emphasizes the empirical domain, what we perceive, experiences, and observations. In critical realism, we only look at this as the tip of the iceberg. Beyond the tip, we look at the actual domain, which are events and non-events enabled or constrained by causes underlying. So some events are observable, but some events are below the surface. We don't see them, right? For example, in the case of the steam, we are unable to see molecules vibrating. We can see the steam, we can see the hot pan under because of how red it is, but we cannot view the intermolecular motions, right? But it doesn't mean they're not happening. In fact, if we have a very good understanding of molecular dynamics, there are many ways of establishing that such movement is happening. So, but the research is really interested not just in the empirical and the actual domain. So, well, the easy way to remember this is just experiences, events, right? And then causes. These are what we call generative mechanisms. These are the causes, and we call this the real domain. So in our pot and pan example, what we saw, the steam coming out and the hot, the hot coil of the range is the empirical domain. And these are the mechanisms, the intermolecular movements and the vibration of the molecules, which cause them to fly apart. And this becomes steam. So the same is true in management. When we see certain trends in management, okay, so for example, if I praise a subordinate and then I notice that, oh, he seems to be more motivated now. So I say praise, productivity. But the question is why? What happens? What happens in the mind? What happens in the self-esteem? What happens in the social status of that person? Because if I now apply praise to everyone, I might get, a rude awakening, because some people do not like being praised in public. Why? Because they can be the subject of ridicule of their friends, who might say, oh, this guy is, buttering himself up to the boss. We won't eat lunch with him, or we'll undermine his work, etc. So it's very important to understand that when we see a surface phenomenon, we first have to understand why it works before we actually use it, because otherwise it can cause what we call unintended consequences. So therefore, I like watching National Geographic, and there are documentaries where they show what happens underneath icebergs, and certainly how icebergs look like underneath is very different from how they look like on top, right? So if I say, oh, I'm an expert in icebergs, and then you ask me why, how many icebergs have you studied? Oh, 10,000 icebergs. Oh, that's a lot of icebergs. And then how did you study them? Oh, I took a helicopter and I flew over the 10,000 icebergs. I took pictures. And then, of course, somebody can ask, you mean you never actually went under the water and looked at the iceberg underneath? No, that wasn't necessary. We can reasonably say to this person, oh, excuse me, but you're not an expert of icebergs. You're an expert on tips of icebergs. Because less than 10% of icebergs are above water, right? So if you say you're an expert of icebergs, but you've only studied less than 10% of it, that is a gross exaggeration. So this is what happens in positivism. Often our knowledge is just from the empirical domain. Well, we can skip this one. Okay. All right. Now we move to a morphogenetic explanatory framework. This is actually leading to the study that I showed. Well, I won't spend too much time on this. Rather, I'll explain this more. Okay. How do we now put these things together? In an organization, we look at a certain situation, and then we look at that situation and ask ourselves, what is happening in this situation? Why is this happening? And in critical realism, there are at least 5 items that we can look at. I say at least because there are others, but these are some of the things that we will consider. These are mental things. Mental things are things that in the minds of people. This might be ideas, beliefs, suppositions, even fears, etc. And then there are social things. Social things are, like norms, culture, language is a social thing, certain agreed upon practices, etc. And then there are natural things. Natural things are those that exist without human intervention, like weather, for example, the heat, rain, the soil in the ground, static electricity. All of these are natural things. And we might ask, do they ever affect us? Of course, the weather affects us. The ionic charge of the air affects our moods. And if we look at our bodies, natural phenomena affect our bodies, right? Mood swings are affected by hormonal changes in our body. Age affects our ability to cope with stress, etc. All of these are natural things. And often when we teach management, we don't discuss this with our students. I have yet to attend a management class where people are made aware that hormonal changes in the human body affects performance. Well, certainly the males have to understand hormonal movement in females, and females should understand hormonal movement in males. But this is something that practically are never discussed in management class. But we know that these are important. They do affect how people behave, right? And then, of course, man-made things. Man-made things are the easiest ones. These are artifacts. The most common ones are computers, of course, trucks, buildings, mobile technology, cell phones, robots, etc. All of these are man-made things. So when we ask ourselves, why is this situation happening? We need to ask ourselves, just in the case of the water causing things to become steam, water becomes steam. What are the things that affect us when we look at organizational reality? All of these are part of the given that affects. Now, we have a desired situation. Let's say we want more productivity or we want less turnover of people. But right now we are at this level. So for example, our turnover, let's say, is very high, let's say 60%. This was the turnover in call centers back in the day. Now I think it has gone down to about 20%. Still high, but it's what's happening. But let's say we want to achieve less than 5%, right? So the question is, why is the turnover in call centers so high? What are the things that affect the situation? Well, it could be mental things. Like people might say, oh, I'll work in a call center, maybe 2-3 years tops, then I'll use it for my resume and then move to something less stressful because my schedule doesn't change so much. So these are beliefs in people's minds, and it can lead to turnover, right? Man-made things, maybe the workstations are so non-ergonomic that people are so affected by carpal tunnel syndrome, backaches, etc. And this has been shown to really affect people's health. Social things, maybe there could be norms in the workplace that make it difficult for people to work, such as a very hierarchical structure, or sometimes, sometimes a certain level of workplace bullying, because some seniors will impose so much work on the juniors and they causes a lot of stress. Natural things, well, maybe weather could be a factor. Like, for example, if you're in a place where there's a lot of rain, flooding, etc. This can also affect, if you're using technology a lot and that you have electrical storms, this can affect the efficiency of the internet, right? Notice that among all of this, I did not mention this, but this is also very important because all of these are givens. But in any situation, what critical realism says is that human agency is a factor. People can choose to do things. People can do things that can change the situation. So therefore, for a practitioner, for a practitioner, one of the things to consider is if we want this situation to move here, we have to neutralize some of these forces here and then strengthen these forces here or add more actions. See? So therefore, we can see that just more than just looking at correlations, regressions, and R-squareds and p-values, we need to understand what are the forces at work in a situation and how can we enable management to address those forces so that this situation can go there, okay? So this is the basic approach to doing that. This is called the basic morphogenetic sequence. So this is from the first phase, we call this the structural conditioning, meaning these are the conditions that existed at the time before action was started. And then social interaction, this is the time from T2 to T3. This is the time that humans intervene on the situation. And then this is the result of the intervention. We call this structural elaboration. So that means if we look at this, the conditioning is everything that existed before the action was done. And then the action is done. And remember, I'm just oversimplifying this. The action can be done also by, by negating this. For example, if the man-made thing that was causing, maybe the employees were resigning because there was a very high level of ambient noise, because the soundproofing in the room was not so good. So people were hearing a lot of noise. Sometimes there's construction in the next building with jackhammers and everything. It was driving everybody distracted, causing migraines, etc. So they can actually improve the soundproofing, and this can improve mental health. And even the positioning of computers, I've read research where sometimes companies, call centers are careless where they put the computers, not being aware that the computers are all facing windows where there is light streaming in. And therefore, this at certain times of day, this causes headaches for people. So it's very important to position computers in non-glare, in glare-free locations. And that's man-made. Where the workstations are man-made, of course, the sun itself is natural. So that means that often in a situation, natural things and man-made things and social things and mental things are all interacting together. So we have to really find a way to tease them apart so that we can act on them. That's basically the explanation. Therefore, in critical realism, according to Manikas, we know that we already have an explanation is when we have real connection, a generative mechanism or causal nexus that produced or brought about the event or pattern that we have explained. That means we have to have a coherent process story. Okay. Sayer, one of the leading lights in critical realism, uses this diagram, which I will use in the sample study I will show in a minute. He says that if you want to explain events, which are here, E1, E2, E3, E4, we need to understand what are the things. And I mentioned to you the different kinds of things, right? Mental things, social things, man-made things, and natural things, as well as action. And they have a structure. Those things have structure. For example, computers do the things they do, not because they're made of glass, silicon, metal, and batteries. They're not. No, computers can do the things they do because of their structure, the way they're put together. So they have power, certain powers. They're able to do certain things. Of course, they have certain liabilities too. Computers need electricity. Mobile phones need constant recharging, but they can do so much. And so if you have, let's say, a man-made object like a cell phone structured in a certain way, it has the power to, connect to other cell phones. Therefore, can be a channel of communication. So if a manager and a subordinate are in a situation where they have to coordinate, then the event that results is a good coordination of an activity, right? But of course, if there are certain conditions, this may not happen. As we know, for example, if you're in a building where the walls are very thick, mobile signals cannot go through very thick walls, and therefore the communication doesn't happen. Therefore, this event means no communication. See, so you have a very rich explanation because you understand how mobile technology works. Because mobile technology has certain powers, but it also has certain liabilities. It has limitations. So we need to know both. So the way Sayer puts this is that object X having structure S possesses the causal power P, but also has the liabilities L, and under specific conditions. And this is very important because this is context. It is not the case that this will always lead to this and lead to that. No, no, no. It will only lead to that under very specific conditions. And this is where culture, language, philosophy, local conditions are very important. Okay? This is a typical structure of a causal explanation. Now, how was this applied? The paper I presented in the Academy of Management, and I called it Understanding Mission-Based Social Entrepreneurship, a Critical Realist Approach. I was very fascinated by the University of San Carlos, because the University of San Carlos in the southern part or the middle part of the Philippines was able to spin off a company, GEMS. One of the most difficult challenges of universities in the Philippines is commercializing inventions of faculty. This might be process inventions or engineering inventions. And so the government has a very active incentive program for universities so that they can commercialize. First, that they can get patents, right? And then commercialize. But there are very few successful commercializations. So I was attracted to understanding why in San Carlos they were able to do it. They invented a process for converting mango waste to edible food products. And not only that, not only did they address the issue of mango waste, because there's a tremendous amount of mango waste in Cebu, in that part of the Philippines. So it has become a health issue. But also there's a lot of out-of-school youth unemployment. So GEMS addressed both by inventing a patented process on converting the mango waste, and then they employed out-of-school youth. So now, a positivist might say, oh, but that's only one company. You have to wait for at least 30 companies so that you have an adequate sample size so that you can generalize because the central limit theorem will apply, etc., etc. And I would say that's utter nonsense. Why will you wait? It is not true that you need those sample sizes to understand why something is happening. Certainly, when the first man on the moon landed on the moon, we didn't say, oh, we needed 30 landings on the moon before we could prove that people could land on the moon, right? The key is how do you assemble a team so that they can effectively, with competence, use this equipment, which has been assembled by engineers, so that they can go to the moon and land on it. So the methodology is an exploratory case study, and then data gathering was around this period in 2016. And then I interviewed the inventor, I interviewed the president, I observed the process, meaning I really went to the factory to find out what was going on. So the analytic procedure used in critical realism is what I showed you about Sayer and the iceberg approach, right? You do look at patterns, empirical patterns, but then you dig deep and find out what's going on. So you look at the events, but you seek to discern structures, mechanisms, and conditions. And then I use the diagramming method for causal explanation. So a little bit about San Carlos. It's a university in Cebu City. As I said, this is the middle part of the Philippines. It's run by a Catholic order. It covers basic education all the way to graduate programs, about 27,000 students in 5 campuses. Okay, I spoke with Father Johnny Miranda, who is the president. And here he explained to me one of the conditions why commercialization of this product became possible. So the agenda of the university was they had a mission. Okay, what can we do to feed the poor, to feed the hungry? So he advocated this to the departments. He said, what can we do? What kind of research can we do? And then he asked, what is the industry interested in? At the time, the issue was pollution. There was much pollution, environmental degradation. Thus, the issue of mango waste became relevant, right? Things like that. So food, water, waste, energy. So you can see that the president created an ecosystem for the faculty to think what kind of research would be helpful for the poor, also helpful to the industry, but also deal with the problem of waste. And so Dean Taboada, Dr. Taboada, was Dean of the School of Engineering. And he became an academic entrepreneur. Now, how is it possible? How can a dean also be inventing and then taking care of a spin-off company? Well, because the university allows it. They have a policy that a dean, if she is able to successfully commercialize a product, they give her time off and support so that she can also administer the business. Remember, this is a spin-off business. It's a separate corporation from the university itself. And then she received an IP gold medal for outstanding achievement. She has a PhD in biochemical engineering. She also has a Master of Law in intellectual property. All of this obtained with the support of the university. And so she holds a patent to this technology. So this is the process that she and her team invented, which was published in 2015. They get mango waste. They go through this process. They produce these intermediate products. And then they go through this manufacturing process. And from this comes out flour, pectin, feed mix, etc. So in other words, from waste to actual edible products. So therefore, they produce zero waste. So from 100% waste to zero waste. Now, how did I use Sayers' model? So the event I was trying to explain was, how was it possible that so many universities could not commercialize, and yet the University of San Carlos commercialized this mango waste process, but also spun off a company? Those are two things, right? After all, you can just sell the product, or you can just, but to actually spin off the company. So the object I focused on was, of course, the academic entrepreneur herself. So I looked at her background. What was it about her? In other words, what made her tick? And then what were her capabilities? Because in other universities, you might have the ability to create the invention, but you don't have the ability to network. She was an excellent networker. Everywhere she went, she was looking for contacts. She was looking for ways to fund the project. Of course, she also had liabilities because she was a dean. So she had a very heavy academic load, and she had very low capital, which is why they needed a partner. But what were the conditions that made it possible? The University of San Carlos had very good intellectual property and support policies, meaning they really supported faculty to have time off to try to see if they can commercialize. They would support their training abroad if it will support the patent. Of course, she also had a supportive family. And then the university provided the laboratory facilities. The administrators would encourage her. And of course, the government poured in a lot of incentives. And so this was my initial, I would call this an initial explanatory model. So notice that in a critical realist explanation, you look at the structures, the powers and mechanisms, and how this leads to certain events. Okay, I think I'll stop here because this is the maximum time I was given. I was aiming to end a little bit earlier, but I think now we'll tackle the questions. Okay, so back to you, Ram Kumar.
Yes, sir. Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I think the chat box is completely full of appreciations. There are excellent sessions. There are many good feedbacks. So with this, I will start the question and answer session. We have one statement from Meenakshi Kulkarni. She's telling the concept of critical realism is new to me. I am from literature field. I just wanted to know if critical realism can be applied to literature studies. If yes, can you please give an example? Well,
I'm not competent to comment on literature studies, but I'll take a guess. I'm thinking, is that for literature reviews? Is that what a literature study is, or is it the study of how literature is written? Would you know? Because this is management, right? This is that a literature review? Is that the question, Ram Kumar?
No, sir, it is not for literature review. I'm from literature background. So some novels can I apply with the help of this theory?
Oh, indeed, yes. Oh, well, now this is going beyond my expertise, but I do think you can, because remember, and this is why this issue of the iceberg, I think, is so helpful. When you're looking at a story or a novel, for example, certainly we can show the development of the story structure from the surface level, right? But we can also see what is happening underneath. In fact, that's why we love novels, because we can literally read the minds of the characters. But often with certain storytelling devices, we might not be shown what the person is thinking at a certain part of the novel, but later on be shown what that is. See? So critical realism gives us a nice way of structuring how to present reality, but slowly reveal what is underneath. So that's my take on it. I think it has a very much promise for literature studies.
Professor, I can add some more value on it. See, if you look at Mark Twain, Twain is, he brought a lot of realism in American society. And he's one of the competitive author in American English literature. So the Mark Twain, all works are from the society only. What American society projects and what is the realism. So he has criticized a lot to the American society at large, and all his works are from the American classical hierarchy of the society. So this is applied to literature, highly applied to literature.
Definitely, yeah. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, right?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And now there is a question. Arvind Gupta wanted to ask. Can yeah, please, sir. Arvind Gupta, sir.
Which question do we tackle next, Kumar?
Arvind Gupta wants to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Are you there, Arvind Gupta, sir? Okay, sir. So I will read the other question. Dana Bhagyam, she's asking, can you explain about Hope State's organization model, please, how it is applicable for organization performance? I think she's asking about Hope State's cultural model, I guess.
Oh, yes. This is a classic model. Yeah, Geert Hofstede did this study a long time ago. He did a survey among IBM employees all around the world, and he was able to classify cultures, the organizational cultures according to certain dimensions, right? He looked at masculine, feminine, collectivist, individualist, etc., etc. This is a classic study. I think it has been updated. There is a more recent version. And this is also quite controversial because there has also been some critiques of this study. But I think one of the nice things about Hofstede's work is that he is saying we cannot generalize the effectiveness of management theory across cultures. It is not sound because the reception of management practice depends on the cultural values of the workers in that country. And yet, up to this day, we impose management approaches across the world, which is really sad because that was the original message of Geert Hofstede. So, for example, in the Philippines, if you have a meeting and tell your subordinates, okay, are we all ready? Are there any problems? Everybody will say there's no problem because people don't admit problems, you know? So a manager has to read between the lines and talk to the subordinates informally and say, so how are we doing? Maybe in the pantry or in the cafeteria. Better yet, he should visit the place where the work is happening. Then he will really know. To just depend on asking people a direct question in the Philippines is a formula for disaster. That's not the best way to find information from people. You have to get to know them, talk to them, earn their trust, in other words. So I think that's one of the most powerful message of Hofstede. And from a critical realist perspective, it is very much consistent with the studies of Hofstede because context is extremely important. It cannot be ignored. And this is, I think, one of the key messages of Hofstede. Yeah. What is our next question?
Next question from Sudha. I don't think this is relevant for critical realism. If an employee working in firms is targeted and loaded with work, that would be the reason. Should he leave? How this is related to behavior of firms?
Yeah, well, earlier we were talking about turnover as a phenomenon, right? And yeah, workload is an issue, especially if you think you're not getting a fair support for the work that you're doing. Or targeted, I'm assuming that might mean you're being criticized maybe or bullied in a way. I'm just making interpretations here. Yeah, well, if it's affecting your mental health, you should seriously consider having a solution to that problem, either by talking to the manager so that the root causes of this problem can be addressed, or if you think that there is really a culture that cannot be changed, which leads to maybe favoritism, so that certain people have less work than others, and so on and so forth, it may be time to consider. But the key point from critical realism is this: you have to ask yourself, why am I being targeted? Or you have to ask yourself, why am I not being treated fairly? Why is the workload so heavy on me? Is it because of the way I express myself? Maybe I lack assertiveness. Is it the way I often expose myself to the additional work by always trying to be the most competent, etc., rather than emphasizing collaboration and cooperation with others? So that could be the relationship with critical realism. It's not enough to just look at phenomenon and say, oh, this is a bad situation, I have to leave. The critical realist will ask, but why is this happening? What is my role in why this is happening? Maybe I'm the one that is contributing to this situation. See? So I think the decision to leave is always an option. You're in a free country, but if you leave and you don't understand the reason why you're leaving, then the same problem might repeat again in another company. So you just keep cycling through that situation again and again because you have no insight. I don't know if that helps, but that's my stab at that question.
Thank you, sir.
Can
And,
I-
yeah,
can I-
please. Arvind Gupta, sir, please.
Arvind here from research scholar from Christ University. Sir, you just mentioned about critical realism and empirical evidence. So I just wanted to check, see in management, they don't get into the bottom of the iceberg. They only see what is evidence and they react according to that. They don't see effort, they don't see anything. So just want to check how relevant it is there for the management, because management will see what you are there on the table, what you see, what you get. But empirical, what you are saying as a really critical realism, which is below the eyes, which is hidden, normally how much it is relevant for the management?
Yes, yes. This is a real problem because precisely, suppose management is looking at analytics, okay? So there are graphs, or suppose management is looking at financial statements. So you have cash, inventory, and then you have income statements. Practically all of the scandals in business, such as, Volkswagen when they cheated on emissions, Enron when they misrepresented their stocks. Notice the common characteristic of all of these scandals. The management only depended on what they can see on the surface, when actually what is the most important thing was what was happening underneath. See? So if management insists on this philosophy of I only look at empirical or quantitative things, that is a formula for disaster. Because you have to understand what is going on. In the old days, this is what Tom Peters called MBWA, or management by walking around. The manager cannot manage by remote control. A company is not a video game that you just manage through a smartphone. You have to be immersed in the reality. Of course, I'm not saying we should ignore the financial statement. I'm not saying we should ignore data analytics on our screen or the reports of people, but we have to combine this with an understanding of what is really going on. And then if we put this together, we have a holistic understanding, and therefore we become wiser as managers. In fact, even human beings think this way. When you put food in your mouth, of course, you don't see what your intestine and stomach is doing, right? But we are told that we have to understand how the stomach and the intestine works, so that when we take food inside our mouth, we can be sensitive not to overstuff our stomach, or not to, eat things that cause gas, because this can cause stomach aches, or, we have to go to the restroom more often than not. We cannot just simply say everything is decided based on what I see. It has to be based on what I understand, and understanding has to go beyond what is visible. It has to go into the qualitative dynamics of why certain things happen. I hope that gives you some ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, and there are, there's few questions from YouTube channel also. One, Mr. Kanchipuram Shankar is asking how it affects Indian students.
Sorry, could you say that again? I lost you.
Yeah. How organization behavior affects Indian students? That is the question from Mr. Shankar.
Oh, well, I'm a Filipino, so I would be very careful not to comment on Indian experience. Maybe you can share some hypothesis with me, but I would imagine as a social anthropologist that as with any other human beings, we respond a lot to status, meaning how we are seen relative to others in the organization, because we want to feel that we belong. We want to feel that we are respected by the people we work with. Of course, we also believe that we should be well compensated for our efforts, because after all, we have needs as human beings. We have dreams for our lives, so we also look at incentives and rewards. These are all different aspects of organizational behavior. And then for decision making, of course, we are also affected by the information we receive, how much time we have to process information. So if we're always being rushed, you need to decide this right now, or I need this yesterday, etc. This tends to affect, or this tends to diminish the quality of our decisions. So those are usually how organizational behavior applies to humans. As to the specific flavors of Indian organizations, that's for you to discover and maybe to share with me. I would be very curious. What is the typical organizational setup in India? So, but those are some perspectives I think would be applicable. Do we have anything more?
I have one question, sir. This could be the final one, I guess.
Go ahead, yes.
When we say critical realism, so as an alternative to the positivist approach, is there any scope for mixed methods which would address the problem of positive approach?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I bypassed that chart, but that's a very good question. There is this article that precisely looks at mixed method, because actually critical realism is open to both quantitative studies and qualitative studies, because they imagine that the quantitative gives you the tip of the iceberg, and then the qualitative study gives you the bottom of the iceberg. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when you have the quantitative, okay, so you have of course you have the scatter plots, etc. You have the p-values, but then you realize that this is just the tip. So you have to go deep and find out what's going on. So normally what you do is you get case studies. So let's say you have an N of, let's say 100 for your survey, and then you get a few of these, and then you talk to them either in groups or you talk to them individually, and then you can find out what are the events that are causing the patterns you see here. I didn't have time, but Ram Kumar, I would encourage you to read this article that this one, How to Phrase Critical Realist Interview Questions in Applied Social Science Research. This came out in just a couple of months ago, and this is where you now go deep. Okay, so surface and deep. Mixed methods is really about looking at the surface, but also looking deep. And this is perfect for critical realism. Perfect for critical realism. And then once you have your mixed method combined, you now use retroduction, which is when you now begin to develop your theory, called retroduction, because we're familiar with deduction and induction, right? Yeah. Retroduction is a little bit different, but in everyday language, this just means make up a story to explain the patterns you see and what you heard in the case. So make up a story and see if that story makes sense. And then you share that story, then it's up for other researchers to check your story. Because a story is just an initial explanation, but the explanation should account for both the quantitative results and your qualitative case inquiry. Of course, you use the literature from the old research, but by combining these two, you now develop new knowledge. But this knowledge must be based on what you're actually trying to understand, which is really this one. Okay, this is this is really the iceberg that you're trying to understand. But you use quantitative methods to understand the surface of it, and you use qualitative methods to try to understand the bottom of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is there any scope for the hermeneutics and phenomenology? Because as you told that this is understanding experience from inside. So will that be applicable for critical realism approach?
Oh, definitely. In fact, there are some phenomenologists that use critical realist approaches. Of course, the phenomenology also looks at the view of the world of the subjects or the participants in a phenomenon, right? And remember, what did we say is one important? Remember, we said that mental things they have causal powers. Remember, so how people's minds construct reality or experience reality or give meaning to experiences affect the way we act. So definitely phenomenology has a lot to consider. But of course, in view of the total situation, phenomenology only looks at mental things and part of the social things. It often excludes looking at man-made things and natural things. And sometimes it's not very detailed with respect to action. But I do think it can make a contribution here, phenomenology.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your.
My pleasure.
I think this 1 hour session is not enough. We should conduct at least 1 or 2 days workshop on critical realism approach. With your support, yes, Firebird will be, preparing for it. I think our director sir will also give approval happily. Now it's time for our director sir to give concluding remarks.
It's a wonderful session, Professor. And you have connected the dots so well and so easily. Everybody, was writing excellent. You made a session very meaningful for all the scholars. And the beautiful fact is that you have given very good importance to the qualitative aspects of the research. You connected the reality that many of us that we read a lot of American theories or Western theories. So as you said that Philippines has got its own society, own social structure, and your behavior pattern is quite different from American behavior pattern. So it became a fashion that we bring a lot of knowledge which is not relevant to us, and we became rigorous researcher rather than relevant, research scholars. So you have created a stage for today relevance. And even I was a little, looking towards you that you will talk about something on realism, on international relationship also. Because today, see that the realistic factors of the war between Russia and Ukraine is something different. But what you see on the surface is different. Actually, the business model or political model are causative factors for the war. So
Definitely.
yes, these are the things I think today. I think the practical and critical realism in organizational study is not confined to only the basic management study. It is relevant to everywhere and every aspect, every functionality. And you have opened the eyes that let us not believe only the quantitative fact. Quantitative facts only the tip of the iceberg. Like you see the behavior of human being at mind level is only, but subconscious, the forces of a mind and brain brings a lot of, the factors which are hidden. So we have opened the in-depth analysis of every research aspect. And I congratulate you. I have listened, a wonderful professor, got enlightened along with other research scholars also. I congratulate all the scholars who were very excellent to listen to you. And I congratulate Dr. Ram to get such a wonderful person in front of us. And thanks a lot from Firebird International Business School to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, sir. I take this opportunity to thank all our participants who joined our Zoom platform as well as YouTube channel. Also, I thank our director, sir, management, our fellow colleagues, our non-teaching staff, technical assistants who are helping us to complete the session successfully. I thank all of you. Thank you so much. We will meet in the next webinar, probably within a month. Thank you all.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Good luck to everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.